Hey everybody, it is Dan Kelson from Next Future Today, and I just wrapped up one of the most fun interviews that I've done in a while, although I have lots of fun with all of my interviews. But this was with Ryan Anderson. He is the VP of Global Research and Insights at Miller Knoll. That's a combination of Herman Miller, where he also worked for quite a long time, and Knoll, and there's a whole satellite of subsidiaries and whatnot that are, as you might guess, all about office space and desks and chairs, and how is all that designed thoughtfully is the more important point that we talked about. We talked about a lot of things. It was a lot of fun. And today's title is Thriving from Anywhere. We talk about working from anywhere. We talk about remote work, but what about thriving? Not just executing work, not just working, but how can you thrive from anywhere? And how can that be purposely executed, designed, and extended? What do we do with all this extra office space that's lying empty in cities? Where can we find out more about companies that are really thriving and doing well and making the most out of all the options that are available and creating options that are serving a variety of people, not just the people managing real estate, not just executives who might be slightly heavy-handed in micromanaging, and middle managers who are stuck in the middle of all that perhaps, but how can it be designed on purpose and executed on purpose to make a modern working life that people want to live? What a wonderful thing. And Ryan has an extreme amount of deep insight into what's going on. He's plugged directly in. Literally his job is to be plugged into the heart and soul of what's going on with work around the world. He's got a global perspective, which is a lot of fun. And we cover a lot. So if you are interested in sort of the human-focused side of remote work from anywhere, distributed work, there's a whole bunch of things that we go into that I won't corrupt you with at the moment. But if you care about making work more enjoyable, more purposeful for more people, I think you're going to like this interview. Let's go for it. Mr. Ryan, I know it's funny because as long as I've been doing podcasts, I've always wanted to start off and say, Mr. Anderson, quoting from The Matrix. So finally, I found somebody with the last name Anderson, and here we are. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Dan. Glad to join you.
Thank you. Yeah. So this show, Next Future Today, is where I like to find people doing cool things that are usually several steps ahead of me, deeper in some area that I know enough about to be dangerous, maybe slightly more than dangerous, but that can help me to jumpstart and sort of, my phrase is slingshot. That's what I wrote about in 2014. Leap forward and kind of skip a bunch of stuff that maybe I don't need to know necessarily. And hopefully the people that are listening and watching get the same benefit out of that, and they get to learn from our insanity combined.
Cool. I'm in.
Awesome. So, like a lot of folks, so we've been, haunting each other, I guess, a bit on LinkedIn. It's slightly sporadic, but it's a great platform. Thank God they're a little behind the times. I mean, 20 years old now. It's kind of astonishing. It's not better on LinkedIn, but given alternatives, we have adult discussions on LinkedIn, which is always refreshing. So combined, I think our primary interest, although I think we have tons of interests we could peel off, is the future of work, which is, not a small topic. So we could peel that apart into a whole bunch of things. I thought we could make this episode called Thriving from Anywhere rather than Working from Anywhere, although that's a part of it. Does that work for you?
Sure, let's run with that.
Okay. So I think, to me, I have a technology background, but I also, thank God, at some point realized that humans are involved in technology. And wouldn't it be nice if we helped the people who are actually using the technology and it was a pleasant experience? And, can you imagine if the pandemic had happened, I don't know, 10 years ago, when video was definitely not a thing and the internet was not it was never meant to do this in the first place, but it was certainly not up to snuff 10 years ago. So thankfully, technology made the pandemic, not easy and not fun or anything, but it made it much more palatable for us to get things done and hopefully thrive. I think there's been a fair amount of people that thrived and got through it and like, oh, okay, this is the new thing. I I asked you in advance because I didn't want to throw you off. So I thought I'd take 2 steps back. So 20 years ago, I was a younger man with more energy. And I read this book about 2002. I was on the verge of becoming an information architect and an experience design kind of guy, unofficially, because it's just me learning stuff. And I learned about this book partly because patterns were coming up very often in sort of the technology world on how do you build SaaS platforms and all sorts of things, and you use patterns and they're repeatable, and it's a wonderful thing. But this is not about that. This is all about architecture and how to design towns and, like sort of real world stuff. So I found this in 2002. It came out in 1977. I knew, prepping for our conversation, that I was like, there's something in this book that I'd be willing to bet that Ryan already knows and understands. And I picked it up off my shelf, and I had not touched it in years, and bookmarked. What do you know? This was a pattern called the Home Workshop, I believe. Yeah, pattern 157. And it starts off, as the decentralization of work becomes more and more effective, the workshop in the home grows and grows in importance. Today, we could call the workshop as your home office, or in my case, this is my basement studio. But, so slightly different. But I was sort of flabbergasted when I grabbed this off my shelf a couple hours ago. I was like, there's got to be something here we could talk about. And holy shit, it's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. What do you think about 1977? This came up. It also refers to another pattern, which is scattered work, which we could call distributed work, right? So none of this is new. Why is it such a hard thing for us to collectively wrap our heads around? This is a thing. We should be good at it by now. This is almost 50 years later.
I know. There's a few things. One is that these things have kind of lived on the edge, and I don't think people have really thought a great deal about it. The other is that we have this penchant for novelty, so everyone wants to call something that has existed something new. You've seen it in the tech world, right? Which I don't have an issue with this, but like the cloud, before it was the cloud, was just other people's servers, right? We tend to like to label things. So right now, the whole world's so cut up in hybrid and this or that, but no, I mean, using our homes for meaningful work, paid and unpaid, having work spread out over distance and become a little bit less synchronous over time, that there's nothing new about that. In fact, if we really take a very old, ancient approach, a lot of people did work adjacent to their home. If you were a blacksmith, chances are you were doing your work next to your home. Offices came around in the 1800s. Like there was this desire to supervise work. And so offices became about supervising work and expressing status. And the more that they became a little more user-centered and a little bit less controlling, the more that you started to see the work evolve and the people doing different things there. So yeah, you're right. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? But that doesn't mean that everybody's ready for it. We need to go back and revisit some of what Alexander and others have done in terms of looking at good practices to build upon to design better places to live and work.
Right. And you've been pretty deeply enmeshed in this for, I don't know, basically
30
your
years.
entire career, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yep. By the time I was a junior or sophomore or junior in college, I was already, I guess, beginning to think about future of work, although we didn't talk about it like that necessarily in those terms.
Right.
And, that book in particular, A Pattern Language, it's such an important work for anybody who cares about user-centered design, because it suggests that human patterns of behavior are the designer. Like the old cliche of the rectangular sidewalk and somebody beating a curved path around like that corner. You ask, well, what's the better design? Well, the design apparently should have been curved, but the designer sometimes only has what they know to work with. And so I do think that, if we were to revisit some of those patterns now with what we know, oh my goodness, it's even so much richer. We did this. Of course, we're looking at work all the time, but we did a specific study of work at home in 2021, observed 100 households in 7 countries, collected more than 10,000 pictures and videos, not just on working from home, but just about life at home. And yeah, everything got massively accelerated. And thank goodness the tech was able to support it. I started working on video, I think, probably, 2004, 2005, but it was very rudimentary. We just were about to get high definition video. It was possible, and video conferencing existed well before that. But to scale it up that quickly and allow everybody to connect with very little notice, no, it wouldn't have been something that we could have pulled off even 15 years ago.
I saw in a recent interview that you posted, you were being interviewed by somebody whose name I did not jot down, and I'm terrible with names, so I can't remember. But part of the discussion was, so the office of the future was a thing that got talked about in the 60s, and, like you could go to Disney World today and there'd be the office of the future, the home of the future, and the Jetsons and all that kind of stuff. And we're not there yet in a lot of ways. But so, I thought 1977, when a pattern language was created, was a bit away. You were talking about how, the things that were being predicted and sort of modeled in the late 60s, that was, even then, it had been talked about for a while. There you go.
Actually, I just grabbed, and I did not pull this for our conversation. I just was actually looking at it. In 1968, the head of research at Herman Miller, Robert Probst, created this piece called The Office of Facility Based on Change, which was, if you picked it up right now and looked at it, and I'm happy to send you one, you'd be like, yes, exactly. It's all about human-centered evolution. It's very much kind of akin to a pattern language. And when Herman Miller, one of the companies within Miller Knoll, first created modular systems product, which are all those movable walls that ultimately were used to create cubicles, which really ticked Probst off, by the way. That's he invented the product. That's the last thing he wanted anybody to do with it. It was really around desktop computing, because for decades, the desktop computers and the Ethernet cables that had to get from the closet to them just tied everything together and tethered the person to one spot. So we're kind of rediscovering some of those ideas from the 50s and 60s now. By the way, Herman Miller's first research into work from home was 1993. It was a piece called Out of Office. And some of what's in there will, make you smile too. People don't want big, ugly institutional things in their home. They want furnishings with a residential vibe that allows you to transition between the sort of paid work you might need to do to paying some bills to maybe having a card game with friends. Like, it has to be seamless. Yeah.
Right.
And I think we're still trying to achieve that too, by the way, but we're getting closer.
Yeah. It's good to hear, and also sad to hear that the inventor of the modular systems would be horrified at how things have turned out. It is a little ironic that modular cubicles that all look the same, why did you bother to make them modular aside from assembly purposes?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the phrase that he used, monolithic insanity or something like that. It was always about creating like this interesting tapestry of places and variety, so that even within a small office, you could get a little bit of choice and go experience different things. But the sheer uniformity of those, just sea of cubicles, that was never the intent. And it was much more about efficiency and more of a Taylorist view of office work being done. It was not so much about creative energies as much as it was getting that data entered in an era of data entry and all the other things that computer work really enabled in the late 70s and 80s.
We'll see if maybe we jump into global trends that you may have seen over time. I did want to, one thing I definitely wanted to bring up. So part of my interest in the future of work is the whole thing about multi-generational work. So my partner and I, we wrote this book in 2014, The Gen Z Effect. I don't think you were tagged on this. Do you know Sophie Wade? She's on LinkedIn. She's a future work thought leader. She said, for Gen Z, there is no return to office, because the office that they would have gone to was not, you were not allowed to go to it because you could die, basically. So that's pretty wild. And this whole return to office movement that keeps coming up over and over and over again, and even though it was talked about 30 to 50 years ago, that maybe the office doesn't have to be in one place. So if they've gotten good at working remotely through college or high school or whatever, and they're comfortable with that, and they don't have to leave their house, and they don't have to get on a train or drive, why would they want to return to the office? Why should I? Everything I've heard about the office is terrible. So why would I do that? How are you seeing that sort of play out?
Well, I am concerned that young people who have entered the workforce in the last few years probably don't get a chance to hear great positive stories about camaraderie or fun or, having cake for somebody's birthday or going out for drinks, and so may not recognize the value in it. And I will say there's a lot of places where, whether it was the office or the office culture, that maybe wasn't as healthy, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that have really enjoyed time together. There's certain parts of the world where we see people really enjoying time in the office. And it's not just in places like India, but that is true there, or Paris. It's also places like Miami. Depends on kind of the social vibe. But I think the key is that we need to allow people to have really positive, good interpersonal experiences that they find enriching, that helps them grow. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So the analogy that I began using in late 2020 was like, people would ask me, do you think we need offices anymore? And I'd say, well, why do you say that? Well, because I've been working from home for the last 9 months and I'm okay. And I'm like, well, you've been cooking from home for the last 9 months. Do you not want any restaurants? And people would smile and they'd be like, well, I love going out to eat. And I'm like, but you don't love time in your office? Some did. But that's kind of the way I think about it, which is there are days when cooking from home is great. There are days where I want that vibe and that buzz and the convenience in some ways of somebody else cooking for me and the special experience. And I've worked kind of splitting my time between my home and the office, which is called Design Yard, where I go. When I go there, it's about hanging out with people. I don't allow my day to be booked with video meetings. I think this is one of the issues, Dan, is that people have a tough time imagining what they would do in an office when they spend 5 or 6 or 7 hours on video all day long. It's like, well, then there's no opportunity to do anything different in the office. But yeah, it's about just allowing people to have some fun and have meaningful mentorship and work relationships in places that they really enjoy. But to your point, I am concerned that there's quite a few people that either haven't experienced it because they entered the workforce when they were too young to have experienced it, or they came from organizations that didn't have healthy office cultures.
Right. Which is
tech.
Very common.
Basically, I'm talking tech.
There's a reason, like you said, there's a reason Dilbert became a phenomenon and Scott Adams became a very bitter old man, apparently. But
apparently,
that's a different.
But having said that, I do hear people frequently tell me that their time in the office can be really wonderful. And if I look at our data, so you probably know we do our own quantitative research, but we're part of many different collaborations. One of those collaborations is called Future Forum. We surveyed 10,000 people every quarter in partnership with Slack, Christina Janzer, who leads research at Slack, BCG with Debbie Lobich, who leads talent consulting there, a guy named Brian Elliott, who founded Future Forum. We found that only 15% of the 10,000 that we surveyed earlier this year wanted to be fully remote. 19% wanted to be fully in the office. Variety of reasons. It could be the nature of their work. It could be that life at home isn't that enjoyable or a place where they can be productive. The vast majority wanted choice. And why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you want more choices than fewer? So it's up to us to make sure that we give them good choices.
Yeah. So that's a great lead into, I found an article, was quoting Greg Parsons, who I think you definitely know. Did he pass away? Yeah. Is he retired? Okay.
No, he's just moved on.
Okay.
Yeah, no. He was with Herman Miller for many years.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So the article, I think it was written in 2013, and it credited him as Herman Miller's former creative director for global work. And this quote is about, he said, "We're designing for the human operating system. A total open office is ineffective. We used to have closed offices, and those were ineffective too. What we need is the right mix." And that's always been my take, especially once I started going to the consulting world. I did pseudo organizational behavior work, and like a lot of Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, they believe in designing environments focused on people. And I landed, I went to their office, like, wow, this is fantastic. Why isn't every office that I've ever been like this? But the U.S. offices, not so much. It had a very different feel, more sort of industrial feeling. Have you seen any organizations that really took this as we really didn't think much about how we were designing how we did work in the office. And then we had this black hole that said, by the way, your office doesn't exist. Have you seen any examples anywhere in the world where they're like, this is our opportunity to really rethink, how do we do this? That's, I've seen startups do that because they're starting from nothing. But for more larger existing organizations, what have you seen that kind of was a reinvention?
Oh, many. In fact, the majority of organizations have, to some extent, begun reevaluating this. Some have gotten a lot farther than others. I'm glad you had that opportunity to see that office in Scandinavia, because it's good that you have a mental reference to what a really great office could be. I'm really fortunate because I've spent the last 30 years touring some of the best, helping to create and touring some of the best offices in the world. Yeah. So I know that what comes to my mind is something that's often much more varied and much more enriching than what people are used to. But I would say, I'm going to actually start before the pandemic. There were already excellent examples of organizations who had embraced the idea of providing more choice, allowing people to move from very social interpersonal times in the office to very solo concentrative. The trouble with cubes and benching or open desks is that they tried to say, okay, you can do everything there. Well, not really. I want to have different options, and you have to lay out the real estate that way. It might mean that if you've got a really lively cafe to hang out in and some really quiet zones to go do concentrative work in, that your desk might not be huge, because that might be only where you do 20% of your day or whatever. So an organization has to make some real estate trade-offs. But I often say it's a little bit like a home. If you were to think about the types of spaces within a home, you'd say, these are the various things we might want to do here, and this is the range of spaces. Do they match up? Same for an office. Whereas that wasn't the mentality before. So if I look at the consulting world, there were a lot of consulting firms that said back in the 90s and 2000s, our people are with clients a couple of days of the week. We'd like them to think about coming in on a Thursday or Friday. How do we make it be a social hub? How do we help it to be a place for them to concentrate if they can't at home? They were way ahead of the curve. I do think there are some tech companies that were leaders in this. And then surprises like insurance companies and others, or even actually the federal government here in the U.S. has designed some amazing, awesome spaces. Since the pandemic, I think if I'm being really blunt, there's been a little bit too much focus on location flexibility, specifically the concept of hybrid. Nothing wrong with hybrid, but it's too one-dimensional. It's really a location policy. So if an organization says, all right, we're going to adapt, we're going to try to provide more choice, we're hybrid, that's not a bad thing. It just then what? You got to figure out what comes after that. So you got to figure out, does that mean you're going to support multiple working locations? Is it about schedule flexibility? Is it about more distributed teams? I probably talk about them too much, but my personal favorite example is the tech company Atlassian. And I have the chance to host our podcast on the future of work and just featured Atlassian as one of the companies we talked about in season 3. Tech company based out of Sydney. By the way, most of the really advanced workplace designs I've seen have been in places like Sydney or Scandinavia, Amsterdam. There's some pockets of the world that tend to push things really well. They've always had great offices. They told their employees in October of 2020, you don't ever have to come back to the office. The employees wanted some spaces though, but the approach they took was kind of like, well, then what do we need these spaces to be? And they created these offices that are really amazing places to gather and do projects and workshop and hang out with your team. It's very content rich. It does support individual concentrative work. They also support work from home. They've actually expanded their number of locations, and that effort is led by a close working friend and thought partner, Annie Dean. She's VP of Team Anywhere. That's what they named the team. So she's got remote and real estate, and they coexist. And I know that's rare, but one of the reasons that I had Annie, and Annie's a part of a regular group that I talk to where we share insights with each other. One of the reasons I had her right on the podcast in the very first episode of season 3 is to highlight it can be, and you can do remote and in office really beautifully. And they're not the only ones. I just think they happen to be a really good example of what this looks like if you push it out a bit. If you give everyone the chance to work from anywhere, most people are not going to say, please close all of our offices. They might say that they want the offices to be something better or something different. But yeah, like I said, we want choices, don't we? Great choices.
Yeah. So does that mean, is there a resurgence? I haven't looked at this at all. Is there a resurgence of like anthropology majors and others that would that would actually be wired to go talk to people and see how they work and how they'd prefer to?
Yeah.
That's the thing?
I am so glad you asked me that. Nobody asked me that. Yes. We work with, and well, first let me start with my own team, because I've got a group of researchers, but also workplace strategists and interior designers that advise organizations. We've got sociologists on the team, environmental psychologists. I do think we have some with applied anthropology background, but even interior designers taking a more anthropological perspective on the nature of that work. It's not about aesthetics, it's about cultures, although you can do both those well. And so I think the social sciences they're so critical right now. And anecdotally, I'll just tell you, I've got a senior in high school, and I just said to her, like, have you thought about anthropology? Because there's a lot of people in business, and this relates, I think, also just to the rise of AI, where more algorithmic or rote activities are being done by bots versus people. Mm-hmm. Have you thought about like the role of social sciences in business? Because I think it's going to go up.
Well, and so part of what I was like, so there's a reason why I'm getting so many invites, because this was before social media and social network platforms were a thing that we even talked about. So I was like, okay, what is it about that? And there's got to be some underlying reason why it's powerful. And that's when I started reading about network theory and graph theory and Mark's work. And there's a whole host of them that really, they wrote accessible. Laszlo Gardoni, maybe one of the names. There's a whole host of like accessible books on network theory / graph theory. Is sort of the same thing for my purposes. And I was like, oh my God, there's science as, because I've made these two connections, now a whole branch opens up over here that I wouldn't have had access to necessarily. And
it does, it unlocks all sorts of perspectives, doesn't it?
Yeah. And as somebody who's, perpetually curious about everything, I don't know, maybe it's actually bad for me. I don't know. It might be unhealthy.
No, this is a good thing. This is the way we should go through life.
Part of the reason I got into experience design, whatever you want to call it, whatever day of the week we're calling it something new. I'm interested in user experience from a consumer tech perspective and what can we learn from that to bring into the enterprise. But most of my career has been enterprise, employee-facing things. And I was like, so we can produce iPhones and apps that are beautiful, and then we can produce ERP systems and other things that are terrible. If it matters for consumers, why wouldn't it matter for employees? And by the way, you were just saying, if the employees are happier, they're more easily able to do their job, and maybe with AI and other automation, things that suck about that job can go away as repetitive stuff, then nobody has to deal with it, and then they can do more fulfilling work. Why isn't that virtuous cycle kind of idea more apparent? Because it drives me absolutely insane.
Well, and what I think a lot of us can learn from is what's happening with UX in the SaaS world. In the interest of transparency, I left our industry for a year or so to go to a tech startup in the SaaS world, partly to learn and understand this. But what I love about product teams in the software as a service world is that they've got this real-time set of data about how their product is or is not being used, and can always be making tweaks and adjustments to try to improve that user experience. And I think actually the built environment, all of our spaces can learn a ton. I often say that people who manage, whether it's a restaurant or a hotel or an office, if you manage space, you manage a product. And you should be looking for those cues of whether or not people are having good experiences there or not. And there's not maybe the same data, although there is some, to be able to say, how do these spaces need to evolve over time? And so that's one of the ideas of that book that I held up about a facility based on change.
We've talked a lot about offices and how those are designed. What have you seen as far as, and maybe Atlassian's a good example of this, I don't know, but for the most part, it seems to me employees were left to fend for themselves when they had to go remote. There was no budget necessarily. It's whatever, good luck. So, you have a computer. What more do you want from us? What do you think? Is that part of what needs to change to really create these environments of wherever the hell it is that you're going to work, that it's done on purpose and not with a $0 budget?
long-term, organizations need to think about how to ensure better work-from-home experiences for their employees. A lot don't want to jump into it right now. They're concerned about their return to office, their real estate use, et cetera. But if somebody's spending 2, 3, 4 days a week working outside of the office, it's in the organization's interest to make sure that it's healthy and productive. But in the meantime, or for those that don't work for a company that wants to do that, the key is in having each person take a bit more responsibility. Maybe that's too heavy of a word, but to basically be involved in the evolution and piloting of new approaches to working from home. But move around, go take your laptop to the kitchen counter, get a few emails done so you can stand, get outside. Even if I know this is crazy, but even if it's winter, sometimes I'll bundle up and go outside to read something or to take a phone call on a walk, or maybe even sometimes use my laptop. But yeah, just really make that space work for you and be mindful that you might be working around something that you piece together that isn't long-term going to work, and see what it takes. The easiest things: tweak that lighting, think a little bit about having some fresh air, open those blinds, get some natural light in. You usually want it in front of you, not behind you, or it's going to throw off the camera. And move, get up and stretch, move, enjoy. And then, ideally get into the office a couple days of the week and make sure that those days are spent really connecting in meaningful ways with members of your own team, but also members of other team. And I think there's a wonderful optimal balance in there somewhere. But like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. And this was kind of the way I worked before we started calling it hybrid or anything else.
Right. I do, and maybe we can hit this on another time, but I do think that, so there's a responsibility on the part of the organization and you as an individual to not just sit there and suffer, but also for when you do go into the office. I've heard plenty, because I work for myself, so I can work wherever I want to. People go into the office and it's just a sea of empty cubicles and they're the only person there and they're just back on Zoom again. And that's not, that is not good. So maybe an organizational policy that says, like, you should only go into the office, maybe not that harsh, but you should only go to the office if you can design a reason for an office day is going to accomplish these kinds of things. And if it's not, just like, don't have a meeting if there's no purpose. You could have been an email kind of thing.
So we do have some customers that have gone that route. We've also had others where they decide they want to spend a certain amount of time where they do the opposite, which is please block those days without meetings to enjoy time with one another and, go get updated on each other's work, see who you run into at the coffee bar, et cetera. And you'd think, that might be a lot of empty free time. No, it'll get filled quickly. And you can always hop on email if you need to.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you, my friend. I'm always glad to continue this conversation, particularly for somebody who's as curious about all the things that we're into as you are. I love that.
I suspected as much, between our interactions already, but it's great to have it cemented. And, maybe someday we'll actually meet in person.
Deal.
All right,
Dan. Thank you.
Thank you so much.